So thank you very much. Please welcome Dixon.
So we are co-zooming this presentation here, and the Zoom is being recorded, so we can all watch this later. It's very exciting. So welcome. It's Hopewell train station night. And so what we're going to do is talk about these two stations, Pennington and Hopewell, why they're interesting historically, why they're interesting architecturally, the history of train service in this area, and then spend most of the night doing a visual tour of photos and artwork that we have showing the progression of these stations and the area around these stations over time. So that should be lots of fun. So next slide, please. I'm going to have to juggle two slides at the same time and make sure this works. Yep, look at that. There we go. Whoop. My first whoops already. So slight add, most of the material that you see here tonight is already up on the Hopewell Valley History Project site. And what the History Project is just an ad hoc volunteer, totally unaffiliated group of people who are grabbing up all the historical material we can in order to get it organized and get it online and freely share it. So we started this a few years ago, and with the arrival of COVID, this seemed like a really smart idea in retrospect, because all that material is up there and you can get at it. And in particular, artists have been very kind about sharing their material as well. And you'll see a historical perspective of why it's interesting to have art as well as we go forward. So the History Project site has 460 documents and over 2,000 images in it now, and 70 plus contributors have contributed material. So if you know of this kind of material, or you know of people who have this kind of material, please talk to us, and we will be happy to follow up. And what I'm presenting tonight will also be posted online. Just give me a little time to get it done. So you'll have the presentation online, and in the bottom right corner here, you also see two briefs, two reports with much more detail about all this. So that will be up there as well. So end of ad, okay? So thanks very much to Anne and the Hopewell Public Library for sponsoring this talk. Thanks to the Historical Society and Museum for supporting it as well. And thanks, of course, to the theater. I've never seen these images so beautiful and so large before, so it's wonderful. We are under a time constraint, though. We need to start moving out by 8 o'clock. So I'm going to move fast, read the slides. There's more information in the slides than I'm going to say, and then come back to the website later and find out more, okay? So we're off here, right? So meet the artists. We do have 4 setups here in the room with art. Ken McIndoe's over here, Jerry Cable is over here, the Saliceros family is over there. You'll see all their artwork. Unfortunately, E.B. Walden's family, who was involved in Gray's Watercolors, the McConaughey business, were not able to come tonight, but there's an exhibit of their material down here as well from our archives, of course. So let's roll. Next slide is the artists. So meet those artists afterwards. I'll try to move fast enough to leave good time for them. And the next slide, some train stations. So look at these two stations. We have Hopewell on the left and Pennington on the right. Gosh, they look similar. Why do they look similar? Well, it turns out they were built by the same railroad, the Delaware and Bound Brook, in the same year, 1876. There's some confusion in sources, but they were both built in 1876 by the same people, Daniel Clarkson and John McPherson, who won the contract to build both buildings. And they were built between September, when the contract was signed, and January, when these stations were already in operation. So very impressive work. The big difference, obviously, Hopewell is brick on the left and Pennington is stone, sandstone on the right. And why are these historically interesting? Well, for one thing, they're still here, so that's good news. That's part of the story, obviously. And they're examples of a railroad in this area and passenger service in this area more than a century. And they're visually interesting. They're Second Empire style, and they have some really interesting decorative details that we'll get into. So next slide. You're faster than me. So we'll break this time period down into three sections: the golden age till the mid-1900s, the sad decline in the latter part of the 1900s, and then the revival starting around 1980s. So here's the quick summary of Pennington, before and after at the top there. So in the golden age, Pennington and Hopewell had 16 to 20 daily stops at the stations. They were really busy. But during the decline, service was reduced. In Pennington by 1963, there were only 2 stops a day. And in 1967, passenger service ended in Pennington. The train service still continued. Hopewell was an express stop before this anyway, and then the service just continued with express service basically at that time. By 1980, New Jersey Transit had taken over these train lines and these train stations and was desperately working on getting rid of all these train stations that it didn't need anymore. So in 1981, the Pennington station was sold as a private residence, which it's been ever since. And so it's been preserved and saved as a result. In the 1980s as well, the condominiums were developed on Railroad Place in Pennington around this train station. And we'll see that in a little bit. Next slide is Hopewell train station. Similar golden age, similar number of stops. The decline was slower because Hopewell still had that express service. In 63, it was down to 6 stops a day. In 76, Conrail took over the collapse of the national and particularly Eastern regional railroads. And so that was the United States government taking over these railroads. Conrail was much more interested in freight traffic than passenger traffic, which was visible in the reduction of service. And by 1976, there was no ticket agent in the Hopewell building anymore. And then the use of the building was phased out as well. And then by 1982, passenger service ended in Hopewell. That whole West Trenton line up to Bound Brook was shut down. In that time period, New Jersey Transit was trying to get rid of the stations and offered it to Hopewell Borough, but Hopewell Borough was concerned about the cost of renovating the station and rejected the offer. So it was bought by a developer in 1984. And then he worked on a whole bunch of plans to put in a restaurant, put in offices, build condos, but that never worked out for him and the market softened. So he sold the station back to Hopewell Borough in 1993. So the borough bought it after all. And then they had to raise the money to pay for the renovations, and they were successful in raising over $1 million in grants from the federal government and also the state government. So in 2001, the station reopened as the community center, which is what it is today. Okay, next slide. So the architecture. So in the bottom in the text are some fancy architectural terms, but in general, what's interesting about this building is this mansard roof. And the 2 long sides of the stations both have this fancy arch, bell-shaped arch structure with pediments above, with finials going up and drops going down, 2 windows, and then a balconette, a small balcony underneath them. So really a fancy design. And then the boards around it have these circular decorations on it. Looks like somebody took a hole punch and went around the edge of the building, punching it out. So this is very, very distinctive design. You don't see other New Jersey train stations looking like this. There are a couple buildings in the area that are somewhat similar. Also, you notice the windows in the left image, the Hopewell image, have a curved, arched design with keystones above them. And on the right, the Pennington windows don't have that. It's stone. It's a little harder to build fancy arches in stone. So the first floor and the second floor windows in Hopewell have the same arch design. The first floor and second floor windows on the Pennington station are just rectangular out of the stone. The other thing on the mansard roof are these dormers, these roof dormers you see on the right, continuing that curved structure projecting from the roof itself, and the windows and the cover above it have that arch structure. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So these buildings in general. So these are relatively small buildings. They're only 20 feet by 55 some feet. They're 2 stories, plus that mansard roof really gives them a full 3rd story. And the other architectural feature that you can see in these 2 drawings is the cresting around the roof. So this is the little fence, little metal fence that runs around the perimeter of the roof. That was part of the original design. Also, the canopy around the first floor was designed with a striped painted pattern that you'll see in the historical photos and in the later renovation as well. The design's very symmetric. These 2 drawings were done by Audrey Jones here in Hopewell. The left drawing is the track side. So in the center is a bay window that projects out. And then you can see 2 doors on each side and for the 2 waiting rooms, and then the symmetric design going up. And then the right image is the street sign, also with 2 doors for the 2 waiting rooms, and then another door on the left. The left of these buildings from the street side have a bunch of utility rooms, and in the bottom picture, you can see that side of the building has a bunch of doors on it. We'll talk about those in just a sec. Okay, next slide. So here's the ground floor. This is a plan done in 1996 showing the state of the Hopewell building. Presumably the Pennington building looked the same inside. It's since been renovated into a residence, so this structure no longer applies inside the Pennington building. So what you see in the top center, the projection out is that bay window, so that's the station master's office. So the station master sits there, looks out over the track. And then coming down from that to the front of the building is the office itself. And you can see there were 2 different partitions shown here in dashed lines for the station master's office. The room to the right, number 100 in this diagram, is the large waiting room, AKA the men's waiting room, of course. And in the renovations, those partitions were torn down. So that's just one big room. You'll see that in just a second. To the left of the station master's area is the smaller waiting room, the ladies' waiting room. And you see the 2 doors coming in from the bottom. And then on the left are these utilitarian rooms. The door all the way on the left front goes up to the steps. So it's number 102 in this diagram. And to the left of that are these separate rooms. So 103 in the bottom left corner is just a storage room. 104 is the men's bathroom. So the men had to come outside and come around the building to go to the bathroom. And then 105, 106 in the top left is the ladies' bathroom, which is accessed from the inside, from the ladies' waiting room. And so the picture on the left shows those doors, that view from the outside of the Hopewell station. So now we're sort of oriented so we can see what these look like. Next slide. So this is inside the Hopewell train station today. So the picture on the left is the view of the large waiting room. And you can see the door going out to the tracks. And on the left side is that bay window. So why was there that bay window? Because that was the station master's office. And why is there a shelf in front of it? Because that was the station master's desk. So that's been preserved in the renovation, which is just wonderful. And then to the left of the bay window is a door that was added during the renovation to connect these 2 rooms, because originally there was the station master's office in between anyway. Then the picture on the right is the view from the small waiting room looking out that same door to the large waiting room. And on the right is a little window. So that was the ticket window for the ladies' waiting room that had access from the inside from the station master's office. So when you're in that building now, you understand why those things are there, right? Next slide. So what did it look like inside this building when it was in use? We have no photos of either train station interior in use, which is very frustrating. But we do have this one painting. So this is an artist named Randolph By, who published a book called The Vanishing Depot in 1973. He went up and down the East Coast and painted historic, but possibly going to go away train stations, and published a book and actually multiple editions of books about it. And he mainly did the outside of buildings. This is the only interior I've noticed that he's done. This is the Hopewell train station. This is the Hopewell station master sitting at that bay window, at that desk, looking out on the tracks and the cars parked across the street. And we're so lucky to have this. And we actually know who this is. This is Mike Denshaw, who was the Hopewell station master there until they closed down the station master in the office. And his family lived at the time in the Pennington station because another railroad employee was living upstairs in the Hopewell station. And luckily, his daughter, Joanne Denshaw, was very kindly responded to my inquiries and sent a whole bunch of information about what it was like to live in these stations. And remembering Randolph By coming by, and remembering her father wearing the same outfit to work 3 days in a row because he was being painted at work. So if you download those briefs that I talked about earlier, there's some wonderful quotes from her about living in these stations. Moving on, the second and third floors. So pretty obvious what you're going to do here. You go up the steps to the top there. 203 is the hallway at the top. To the left is room 205. That's the kitchen in both of these buildings originally. And then there were additional rooms segmented off to the right. When the Denshaws lived here, that was living room and master bedroom space, basically. The third floor looks very much the same. There's a room to the left. So the room above 205 and the third floor was the bathroom for the upstairs tenants. And then the rooms to the right, when the Denshaws were there, were the children's rooms. And she has some lovely stories about the owls and the mice and the other critters who lived up there and how it shook when the trains went by. The buildings also have a full-size cellar and full depth cellar. So all of that was built in very quickly when these buildings were originally done. Next slide. So that's the end of the introduction, the basic history, and the basic architecture. So let's now look at a whole bunch of pictures. The challenge for you folks is to see what's changed. I'm not going to point out everything, but I'll point out some of the interesting things. And then you can come back later. I'll have these slideshows up and some more images in the slideshows as well. Okay. Next slide. We're starting with Pennington. So we'll talk about the golden age in Pennington. Next slide. So this is the Pennington station in 1907. So you see what apparently is the staff out there in front of the station on this broad stairway. In the middle is the bay window, and you can sort of see some signage in there, and you can see some of the office fixtures in there. And you notice there's no cresting on this building. There's no balconette on this building. We don't really know whether that was originally in Pennington or not. Next slide. 1910s. So very similar image. Huge pile of telegraph wires to the right and narrow steps in front. And you'll see the same kind of progression happening in Hopewell. Next image. The decline, the sad decline in Pennington. So next slide. So 1960s, probably before the train station service ended, you can see there's a fence down the middle of the tracks. And so the question arises, how did you cross these tracks? How did you take the train in the other direction? We'll get to that. Okay. Next slide. Thank you. So this is a 70s, 80s postcard. We don't have a good date on it. So this is the canonical view in Pennington. You're looking down the tracks, looking north. That's the North Main Street Bridge in the distance. To the right of that is that industrial area as you approach the bridge with silos and storehouses. And you see the two tracks and you see the fences going. Okay, so next slide. So this is an example of what the artists do for us, because we don't have a picture that looks like this. This is the passenger shelter on the left across from the Pennington train station. And Gray's watercolors, which is exhibiting down here, captured this for us. So in the distance, you see the silos and the other industrial buildings down there. And you see there was a shelter. It was not directly across from the station. It was a little south of the station. And you see there's a long platform in front of that station. So wouldn't it be nice to know more about that? Well, Joanne Danshaw, in addition to sharing a whole bunch of information with us, also shared some photos. So these are the Denshaw's 1974 photos of the Pennington train station. So the station was out of business, but the Denshaws were still living there. So you see the tracks going up to the North Main Bridge. You see some of that industrial equipment there. And on the left, you see the beginnings of that platform that ran down to the passenger shelter. So if only they panned the camera left and took another picture. Next slide. So there's the passenger shelter, circa 1974. So it was no longer in use. The Denshaws were trying to keep it cleaned up. But you notice this, we still have this open question of how do you get to this shelter? Does anybody know how you get to the shelter in Pennington? Underneath, yes. So next slide, pan left. We're going to pan left again. At the end of the train tracks was a passenger tunnel. So this is the little shelter around the passenger tunnel that went under the tracks, basically at West Franklin Avenue. And we have some other Denshaw images as well that show more of this. Next slide. So the revival. Next slide. So in 1981, the station was sold for private use. These are a bunch of images by Ralph Curcio, who was a railroad enthusiast and a photographer, and he took over 10,000 images of railroads in this multi-state area. And after he died, he turned them over to his friend Dan McFadden, who has been doing a wonderful job of digitizing them, sharing them with people who are interested. And we're obviously very interested. So these have only arrived in the past couple months, and hopefully Dan is on the Zoom here tonight. So this is Ralph's picture of the Pennington station from the tracks about the time that it was turned over for private use. Next slide. This is Ann Gross, who many of you may know, lived in Pennington for quite a while, did a lot of these kinds of images of local buildings. And it's just a great view of the Pennington station as a structure. Next slide. This is fun. This is William Hankinson, who also lived in Pennington for a while. And this picture lies. What's wrong with this picture, right? Well, for one thing, the train tracks curve the wrong way. But if they curve the other way, they'd go out of the picture. So he did it this way. And for another thing, he decided this building looked too thin. I mean, we talked about how small this building is. So he doubled the width of this building. He doubled the windows in the width of this building. It looks much fatter than it really is, but it looks right. You know, this is his image of the Pennington station, and people love it because it's a fun image of the Pennington station, even though it's in, you know, technically it's horribly wrong, but you got the gestalt, right? So it's really fun. Next image. So this is a postcard from the 80s. How do we know it's the 80s? Because you can see the condos on the right. So this is the building renovated, cleaned up, the grounds cleaned up as well. Next slide. This is what the underpass now looks like in Pennington. So if you go to West Franklin Avenue, down by the tracks, this is the underpass, which has since been filled in, but is still remaining there. So you can walk down to nowhere right now. And there's a similar underpass on the other side of the tracks as well. And one more slide. So this is the Pennington station today. This is the street side. And you can see it's been fully renovated. It has the balcony added, which with a drop, but not a finial, which is an interesting choice, as it is above. And it survives. It's just wonderful how this building has survived and been taken care of and is still going strong. So that's the Pennington side of the story. So next we're going to do the Hopewell side of the story. You beat me to it, weren't you smart? So next slide. So I call these iconic images of Hopewell. This train station is really iconic, and this is a great example of it. These are the Welcome to Hopewell Borough signs that were put up on the 5 entrances to Hopewell. And they were created by Fire Dance Studio of Hopewell in 2014. And just look at this train station. You know, in one sense, it's very abstract. It's just windows and doors. But the amount of detail he put in to capture all the details and the holes and the cresting and all the rest on this roof is just spectacular. So these signs are still going strong today. So these are just wonderful. Next. So we're going to do Golden Age in Hopewell next. So we have 2 images here from the 1890s. So this is 5 to 10 years before those first Pennington images that we had. And so what do you see here? On the right, you see the train station. It still has the balcony. It still has the cresting. It's still around today. You come down the stairs from the train station. You walk down the platform. At the end of the platform is a siding with a boxcar on it. And behind the boxcar is a small white building. That's the freight station that's still there in Hopewell a century later. And then there's 2 tracks, and across the tracks is a raised platform as well. And then one of the details to look out for as we go forward, to the left of the train station are 2 poles. The first is a semaphore signal, which is going to be replaced soon. And to the left of that is a telegraph wires, because the train station was a telegraph headquarters, because you could run those wires right down the train tracks. And it has 4 cross arms already. A lot of telegraph traffic is going. Next slide. So this is same time period. This was published in 1897. So this is the canonical view of the Hopewell train stations from the Greenwood Avenue Bridge looking east. So you see the 2 tracks, you see sidings on both sides. To the right, you see the station, of course, itself. And then beyond that, you see the freight shed. You see some trains there on a siding. And then across, you see another siding with an active train. And then the building on the far left says Lister's Pure Fertilizers, R. Savage. So Reuben Savage was a general store operator, basically, up in Mount Rose, but got in the business of selling fertilizer. And so he had his own spot on the trains to do that business. So this is 1890s, and for a long time, we thought this was the oldest image that we had of Hopewell. But because of the History Project and because of collectors like Stephen Cohen, who found a sort of interesting looking image and grabbed it for us, we have the following image. Next slide. This is 10 years earlier. This is only 5 years after they built the train station. This is a broadsheet ad, basically, for Reuben Savage's business, where he came down and posed this photo showing that 200 tons of fertilizer was delivered this day. And this gives you a real visceral sense of what it means to have a train station in your town, the kind of business you can do, the kind of quantities of products you can move, the farmers that can use fertilizer and grow crops better. And then you can ship out products as well. So it makes sense to build, a tomato factory in your town. So you can move out those cans all over the country and beyond. The Army was buying Hopewell cans for the World War, for example. So here we have 10 plus boxcars lined up, 10 plus horses and wagons lined up, and a whole bunch of people just showing what business looked like in 1881. I mean, it's just wonderful. So yeah, that really looks good there. That's great. So next slide. So we're going to move up forward in time. Now it's 1907, roughly the same time period as those early Pennington images. The thing to really notice here is the gardens. So the railroads were selling railroad service, promoting railroad service, building attractive stations, as you've noticed, and putting gardens out as well, supporting those gardens. Pennington, for example, had not only gardens, but had a fountain as well. And so let's go to the next slide, 1909. So this is a hand-colored slide. The things to notice here is there's no balcony anymore up in the arch on the third floor. There's no cresting on the roof. So all of that disappeared within the first 20, 30 years of these stations. Then straight ahead, these telegraph wires have many more cross arms on them. Telegraph business is going strong. Next slide. The canonical view at that time. The thing to notice here are the banjo signals on poles. The pole to the left at this end of the platform and the pole to the right at the far end of the platform have a new kind of signaling mechanism in Hopewell. And then there's a whole series of poles carrying signal wires running down the tracks on the other side. So that's one way to understand when an image was shot in the Hopewell area. Next image. So here's the train station in the snow. Is that somebody up on the pole in the middle there? Is that somebody up there? Does it look like it? It just makes me freeze just looking at that. So beyond is Front Street. People wanted to live near the train, apparently. And the interesting thing here, just to the left of the train station peeking out, is the passenger shelter. So this is about when Hopewell acquired its passenger shelter. Okay. So we're going to start skipping forward now. 1934, whole bunch of changes. 4 tracks, a fence down the middle of the tracks, a path across to the passenger shelter. The railroad wasn't actually running 4 tracks. The outside tracks were sidings to feed other tracks for businesses. Next slide. Decline, the sad decline till 76 when they stopped having a station master, and 82 when they closed it all down. Next slide. Great image, 1955. Same buildings that you're now familiar with and seeing again and again. On the left side of the tracks, you notice we're missing one of the 2 tracks. That whole siding was taken up, and the sidings off to the left where Lister's was is gone. And on the right, there's this really goofy thing. So there's the original platform, the siding, then they put another platform in. See, I'm waving my fingers, platform, with the line down the middle, so that the train still came on the inside track and the passengers had to walk out to it. And you'll see that in just a sec. The other thing to notice here in the distance down the train tracks is a new kind of signaling. So there are signal bridges, so the metal that span the track, and you can see 2 signals on the bridges in the distance there. Next slide, thank you. So 1970s, the fence is gone, the telegraph wires are gone, and you can see how built up that bridge is in the distance. The railroad was constantly working to raise that bridge so they could cram bigger and bigger trains through it. They even lowered the tracks at one point for that. Next slide. So this is a ran-off by of Hopewell. On the left, you see those 2 signal bridges, the close one and the far one. They now just have 1 signal each with 1 light on them. And then the building in the far left is the signal tower, which was staffed by a railroad employee. charged with making sure trains didn't crash into each other, if you know what I mean. Next slide. So these are two Gray's watercolor images, looking in each direction. So here we have the signal towers in the distance there, that blob of red on the left. And then if you spin around, here's the Grays in the other direction. And the bridge in the distance. Next slide. Thank you. This is a great photo by Ken Kaplowitz, who lived in Hopewell in the mid-70s and beyond. And he's just turned over his collection of Hopewell images to the History Project. So definitely go take a look. You actually see a caboose here, something you never see on trains anymore. And to the left of the train station, you see a whole bunch of supplies that have been brought in for the business there. And then on the right end of the train station, you see one of the windows has been boarded up. Next slide. So now we get to Ken McIndoe. So you have some of his other images over, or you have one of his other paintings over there in the corner. So Ken is not totally realistic. What's the right word for it? But the detail that he captures from a historical perspective, ignoring the art issue, ignoring aesthetics, is just wonderful. So you see these two bridges here. They're not really this curved, but you see what they look like. You see what signals were on the bridge. You see the signal tower in the distance, the red tower there. You see that somebody was living in a house right next to the tracks. And then you see all these sidings. So you see tracks and sidings and then additional sidings, and on the far right, the sidings split again. So the railroad put in all these sidings to service business in the Hopewell area. It's just fascinating to see them here, because we don't have any other close-up images of what this looked like. Next slide. So this is another image by Ken. And here again, he captures things that nobody else has captured. So one is the cars parked here, how they parked, and the number of people who parked to catch the train here in Hopewell. And the other thing, if you look at the passenger shelter, the thing you notice is it has a chimney. Now, that chimney was sort of visible in the earlier images, but Ken really stressed it for some reason. And now you go back and look at those images. Oh yes, they had a little stove in the passenger shelter, which sort of makes sense in the middle of winter, right? So next. So this is Ralph Curcio in 1976. And so you can see how the people came out to catch this train. This is the train into New York early in the morning. So starting from the left, there's a guy on the stairs. Then there's some people on the original platform. Then there's some people standing in the weeds on the siding. And then there's this platform, which is this narrow piece of asphalt with a white line down the middle. And that's how passenger service worked in Hopewell for decades. Just fascinating. And hey, it worked, right? Next slide. This is actually our only image that gives any hint of what this, the inside of the Hopewell station looked like. So this is Ralph Curcio again. And then this is the view into the small waiting room and across. Doesn't tell you a whole lot, but if you look at the schedules that are posted there on the door, 2 trains during the week in each direction and 1 on the weekend. That's all the service that Hopewell had. Next. Gary Soretsky is another local photographer who also provided a whole bunch of images. And this is a great image that shows a view we don't normally see down the path from the railroad bridge to the train station. And then the next image is just a wonderful, wonderful image of the train station. Not your typical view, just wonderful. Next image, George Stave, another painter in the area, did this great view. And to the right, you can still see the passenger shelter peeking out. Next, Revival. Okay, a little sad as it worked through, but eventually success. Next image. So this is a Sal Sorrow image. The family's over there in that far corner with some of his art. Fascinating image. The detail he chose to show, and then the way the detail fades at the bottom. You can see the passenger shelter peeking out on the left, and he put cresting on top of the building. The cresting was long gone by this time, but he knew about it and he added it because it makes the building look better, right? Next image. Ralph Curcio, 1981, looking across the tracks, a really sad, bedraggled building with graffiti all over the bottom. So things are not going well here. Next image. The train station, 1981. This is a passenger train arriving, and you can see the decrepitude of the station as the people got out here. It's really sad. And then the next image, same time, same view, but here's a freight train coming through. And canonical view, same old stuff. Decrepit train station on the right, decrepit freight shed beyond that, decrepit passenger shelter to the left, and then down the way is the signal tower still there. So the buildings on the left have been restored. We still have them. The buildings on the right are now gone. Next. So long discussion, particularly in Hopewell, what to do with this station. Can we afford this station, et cetera? Long discussions in the newspaper. So Conrail did board up part of this station, but was not interested in maintaining it, obviously. Next. This is a great view from the passenger shelter looking across to the train station. This is when the developer owned it, and he was basically stabilizing the building, boarding up the windows and repairing the roof to protect it. Next slide. After Hopewell took ownership of the building, but before they had money to do anything with it, they painted the boarded up windows. So these are just windows painted with black paint, and it makes such a difference. It's so smart what they did here, because the inside of the building really looked awful. And I have a couple photos of that. So hang on a sec. Next slide. This is the downstairs inside. This is that small waiting room we talked before. And here's the ticket window from the station master's office into the small waiting room. Pretty decrepit, but not, totally hopeless, right? But speaking of totally hopeless, next slide. This is the upstairs. So on the left is the bathroom the kitchen on the second floor, and on the right is the bathroom on the third floor. I wouldn't want to live there, right? So this is how the station looked in '96 when Hopewell was figuring out how to renovate it. Next slide. So here's the renovation starting in 1999, once Hopewell had the funding to do the renovations. And next slide. This is the result as captured by Jerry Cable, who's here over in this corner. So Jerry had a one-man art show, which is probably the first such event in this station once it was reopened as a community center. And you can see the warmth of this station as he captured it. It's fully restored. It's got the balcony, it's got the cresting, it's got the drops and finials and all that kind of good stuff. And it makes a great Christmas card. So Jerry actually used the Hopewell station, even though he's not a Hopewell resident, two different times for his annual Christmas cards. So this was one of them. And next slide. This is the second one. So he called this Stationary Survivor. And remember the Hankinson image, and the station looked so, Hankinson had to spread the building out to make it look reasonable. But this building has some weight when you look at it. It has some presence. When you look at Hopewell from an aerial view, the station is nothing. It's just a tiny little building that disappears among all the other buildings of Hopewell. But because it stands by itself and because we see it from ground level, it has much more presence, and that's what Jerry has captured here, I think. The Pennington station is surrounded by trees now, so you don't have that same sense with it. Next slide. And then the last slide here wow, I just finished on time, is the station restored 2003 Christmas. And you see all those different components that I've talked about all along. In addition, they added these Shepherd's Crook lamps on the left side, excuse me, the right side, which jazz up the place. And in the bottom right corner is a hunk of metal, which still stands at the station and which I didn't pay any attention to at all until I figured out what it was. That is the end of a siding that ran in diagonally from behind the freight house to right next to the train station here, that was used for years and years, decades and decades, for offloading products, and still there. So that's the end of the story. Thank goodness these two stations were saved and restored so lovingly, and they make a really great story. As I said, I'll be putting the presentation online with some additional material, and then there's the reports I wrote that have even more gory detail and fun stories from Joe and Denshaw and others. There's lots more artwork online as well, so enjoy. And if you'd like to contact me, if you have some cool information to share, I'd be happy to digitize it and share it. And if you have questions, because we're running out of time here, my email address is on the website, so please do feel free to contact me. So thank you very, very much. Appreciate it. So I want to give you a chance to see the artists here, but do you want to bring up the lights a little? If you want to wander around and see the artists. And are there any questions I can address as well before we quit?
Hey, Doug, where did you get the
Yes, sir.
station?
The architects are on one of the first slides. So there were two gentlemen from the builders are on the first slides, the two gentlemen from Pennington. We don't know the architects, but there was a local architect named Graham, I believe, who designed buildings very similar to this. And there's a building that was in Ewing that only recently came down, the Ewing Lodge, that has the same decorations in the middle of the building. So there's something going on there, and we haven't totally figured it out yet. But there's a possibility that we know the connections. So thank you. Jerry.
Is there any information about why these two were so grand as opposed to a lot of, like, Flemington had a, Harry had a station?
Yeah.
They were nothing like.
Why are these stations so interesting? We don't really know. The Hopewell Herald talks about a bid to build these stations. And so the railroad must have asked for pretty fancy stations because these guys won the bid. And I'm sure they didn't propose something ludicrously fancy by their own. But why the railroad chose these two to be so interesting, don't know. Good question. Anything else? Gone. Thank you very much. Thank you. So we have about 10 more minutes, so please come down. Jerry's here. The Gray's Watercolors is here. Ken McIndoe's there. His paintings are much more interesting up close than anything I can show you. And then Sal Cero's paintings are over there in that corner. Thank you. And thanks to all your web people at all. Are there questions we can talk about on the website? I haven't really looked at the chat.
I have a question for you.
Where did the station master title come from? I have no idea. It's just the term they were using. John K. has a question.
Maybe.
Annette says, thank you.
Do it again. Try again. Question for you.
I don't see any other questions in the chat, do you?
You got to go through the chat, I guess.
You can ask your question online if you'd like.
So I'm looking at the chat.
Does somebody have a question that they wanted to ask?
Any other questions on the chat?
Can you read it? I missed it.
Tunnel under the Hopewell station? No, there was just the Pennington style.
Is it up
Hopefully
there?
just walked right across.
Oh,
Why were there men's and women's waiting rooms? What if you're traveling as a couple? I don't know. I don't know. We don't have contemporary discussion about these two waiting rooms. We just assume from the convention of the time and the way the bathrooms were set up. So good question. Station agent, yeah. John suggests station agent is better than station master. The Denshaws called their father a station master, so I was running with that term. DNBB was attempting to lure potential traffic away from the Pennsylvania Railroad. Yeah, good point. Good point. So these were key stations on the line, right? Yeah, no tunnel in Hopewell, just in Pennington, and Hopewell you just walked across the tracks. So it looks like we're done with questions. So yeah.
What would happen if somebody
We
was
done here, Bob?
hit by a train?
We're done here? Is asking what? Oh my gosh, yeah. Yeah, there are newspaper reports of people being involved in train accidents and also cars being hit with the train crossings as well. So it's pretty icky. So yeah, I'm watching the chat here. We're trying to relay any other messages that come. Thank you, Sandy. Time to shut down? Okay, so thank you all very much on the Zoom side. Thank you. We're gonna shut down now.